Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Gutman. I'm one of the attorneys at the Cuddy Law Firm. Here with me is Catherine over audio, who is another attorney at the Cuddy Law Firm. So this presentation is being done right now for everyone who's currently in the meeting, as well as being recorded for anyone going forward. So we just want to make sure that we have a clear picture and that we take the time to make sure that we have concurrent Spanish interpretation as well.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Mark Gutman, soy abogado en la firma de Cuddy Law Firm. Estoy acompañado con la abogada Catherine Aquino Melendez, que va a traducir todo en español y vamos a estar traduciendo a la misma vez.
Okay, so the purpose of this presentation is not going to be very long. I don't want people to have to sit here and watch an entire law class on what is a due process complaint, but I do want to give basically as I have written here, the A through Z of a special education case. So kind of where we start, what we look at, and how we get to the end, and everything that goes into a case, a big overview of that.
No quiero extender esta presentación, pero quiero repasar todo lo que incluye la educación especial, comenzando con la letra A, concluyendo con la última letra del abecedario, la Z, para saber qué se debe considerar.
So what I'm hoping that you'll get out of this is, if you're considering potentially finding an attorney for a case or bringing a case yourself, or maybe you either have a child who you think might need special services, or you might know someone who has a child who might need special services, you have a better understanding of what would really happen, and you'll know if it's the right move for you to make or not.
Entonces, si ustedes tienen un niño con discapacidades, necesitan servicio de educación especial o conocen de alguien, así pueden saber y tener la información necesaria.
Okay, so first, what is a due process complaint, right? So the word due process, it's fair treatment, right? It's the legal requirement that the state must respect the legal rights that are owed to a person.
¿Qué es un debido proceso? Es el derecho y tratamiento igual, un requerimiento legal que el Estado debe de respetar los derechos legales de la persona.
So in this case, we're making sure that the Department of Education, or if we're outside New York City, whatever district it is, are respecting the legal rights that are owed to parents and to students.
Entonces estamos viendo si en la ciudad de Nueva York o fuera del distrito de la ciudad de Nueva York, que las escuelas, los distritos escolares están dando los debidos derechos y respeto a los padres con niños con discapacidades.
So due process is basically a fancy term for did the district legally do everything right?
Entonces el debido proceso es una palabra más formal para confirmar si el distrito escolar hizo todo lo necesario.
So now, what is a due process complaint, right? It's the complaint that due process wasn't followed. It's putting the state's wrongdoing into words, into that formal document.
Entonces, ¿qué es una queja de debido proceso? Es indicando que el distrito escolar no hizo lo que debía de hacer.
I also want to point out at this point that if anyone has questions, best way to ask them is to open the chat function in Zoom, and we'll see if I can get to them during the presentation, if not potentially after. But if it's a very fact-specific case, if you're asking for a question about your child or a child you might know, it's probably not something that I can answer here, and I'll give the contact information so we can discuss something like that off the call.
También quería indicar en este momento que si tienen algunas preguntas, indicar en el chat lo que quieren saber y le puedo proveer una respuesta general.
Okay. So,
si tienen alguna otra pregunta, podemos hablar fuera del chat.
So when we're talking about a due process complaint, right, it means that the state didn't do something they're supposed to do. So in order to do that, we have to know what is a state supposed to do. And we'll start with, what is a student really entitled to?
Para saber qué se le debe al estudiante, hay que considerar lo que el estudiante necesita inicialmente.
Right, so a student is entitled to, the legal term for it is a free, appropriate public education. You can sometimes hear that referred to as a FAPE, right, F-A-P-E.
Lo primero es que el estudiante debe de recibir una educación pública, gratis y apropiada. conocidas con la letra FAPE o FAPE.
So in determining whether or not a district provided a FAPE, you're looking at, did they give the right placement for a kid? Did they do the right services, things like speech language therapy or occupational therapy? And did they do the right evaluations? Did they perform evaluations at all? Those are kind of the three main things that I generally look at.
Para considerar si el estudiante recibió una educación apropiada, hay que considerar si el distrito escolar le proveyó una colocación apropiada, servicios apropiados como la terapia del habla o terapia ocupacional e evaluaciones conducidas apropiadas. Esos son los 3 puntos que yo considero cuando estoy repasando una educación, un caso, si es una educación apropiada.
So if we have a belief that FAPE is not being provided, right? A student's not getting an appropriate education, maybe because they're in a wrong class size, maybe because they're not getting the right related services, maybe because they weren't evaluated properly. That's when we would begin to think about doing a due process complaint.
Entonces, repasando el caso, el archivo, si me doy cuenta que no le colocaron al estudiante en una clase, una escuela apropiada, si no le dieron los servicios adecuados, si no evaluaron adecuadamente tampoco, entonces se puede considerar someter una demanda contra el distrito escolar.
Okay, so how do you know if a student is being provided a FAPE or not, right? Because a lot of times you're not in school, at least before remote learning, right? You weren't in the school with your kid, so you might not know. So this slide, we're going to talk about how might you figure out that a school might not be providing a FAPE for your student.
¿Cómo saber si la escuela le está proveyendo una educación apropiada al estudiante, ya que ustedes no estaban presentes en la escuela durante el día escolar? Claro, eso es antes de la educación virtual que está ocurriendo hoy día.
Right. So you might be getting reports from the school that your child is going to be held back a grade. You might see poor grades without changes. And by without changes, I mean, if you have a student who's not getting the grades that you think that that student should be getting, and the school agrees that they're not getting the grades that they should be getting, things should be put into place to make sure that student is able to make progress. If you're seeing year after year, a student's not making progress, that's an indication that the school probably isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Entonces, el primer punto es los reportes, que el estudiante tal vez no va a pasar al siguiente grado. Si ustedes notan que el estudiante años tras años no está progresando, entonces tal vez que el distrito no le ha proveído la educación apropiada.
Okay. Another thing is maybe regression at home. If you have a student who maybe wasn't very verbal and then started to become more verbal, and next year all of a sudden you see that now the student is right back to being nonverbal. He's not communicating the way that he or she might have been communicating before, or maybe not reading on the level they were reading before. If regression means that the student it's the opposite of progress, right? They're going backwards. That's an indicator that the school might not be providing a FAPE.
Y ustedes se dan cuenta que tal vez el estudiante está retrasando en la casa, en el hogar. Tal vez era un estudiante que podía hablar y no lo está haciendo, o podía leer y no lo está haciendo. Eso puede ser una indicación que en la escuela no le están dando la educación apropiada.
Or maybe you have a case where doctors' recommendations are being ignored. Maybe you brought your child to a specific doctor to get some kind of outside evaluation. And maybe that doctor said that a student has autism, but the school district ignores it, right? Or maybe the doctor said that the student needs speech language therapy and the school ignores it. That might be an indication that there's the denial of FAPE.
También se puede considerar que el distrito escolar está ignorando las recomendaciones del médico, pero usted le llevó una nota del médico del estudiante y la escuela lo ignora. Eso también puede ser una razón de falla de educación apropiada.
Now, to be clear, any one of these things, or even all of them, don't necessarily mean that there was a denial of FAPE. These are just indicators that maybe we should look into the records a little bit more.
También quiero notar que todos estos puntos no significan que si el distrito no cumplió es que no le proveyeron la educación apropiada. Simplemente son puntos que me hacen pensar, debo de repasar más el archivo.
So now another thing I want to talk about before I go any further is the fee shifting provision, right? So what this is is it means that if you hire an attorney for your case for a special education due process complaint and you win, you could be entitled to attorney's fees from the state, right? So they would have to pay for your attorney's fees. And the reason for that is because the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, should be applied equally to everyone, whether you can afford to have an attorney or not. So therefore, there's this provision in there that says that if you can't afford an attorney, but an attorney represents you anyway, they can get their fees afterwards if you win the case, if you prove that you had a case that was valid and you won.
También le quiero informar que la ley IDEA, que significa Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, indica que tiene una provisión que indica que si su abogado gana el caso, puede recompensar los honorarios de esta provisión y que la parte que pierda se tiene que cubrir los gastos, los honorarios.
So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is the federal law that all of these cases fall under. It sets specific guidelines for what school districts need to do, and when they fail to do it, what might happen.
La ley IDEA es una ley federal que significa donde que el distrito escolar le debe de proveer la educación apropiada al estudiante, no importa lo que sea.
So now what does the attorney do, right? Because either the attorney or it's possible that you can represent yourself pro se, which means without an attorney. But let's look into what exactly it is that they would do when a case like this might come up.
A ver, entonces, ¿qué puede hacer el abogado? Claro, si se busca un abogado que la asista, porque tal vez se representa usted mismo en un juicio.
So the first thing that I do when a case comes onto my desk, right, or for any of my team members, is we look at everything that we can get from the records, right? And normally parents go and they request the records from the school district, and then they would provide it to us.
Lo primero que yo hago cuando recibo un caso nuevo, e igual mis colegas, es repasar los records educacionales. También los padres pueden buscar y pedir los records para los estudiantes.
Right, so we're looking at IEPs first of all, right? I want to see what kind of placement was this child in, what were the services they were getting, what were the teachers saying about them, what complaints were the parents maybe making, if any, if they were in the IEP, and what the functional levels of a student are.
Estoy repasando el IEP, el plan individualizado, viendo a ver qué necesitaba el estudiante, qué quejas hizo el padre o la madre, si estuvieron presentes en la reunión del IEP. ¿Qué ocurrió?
So, and what I'm looking at is I'm comparing one IEP to a prior IEP and then to a prior IEP. And I'm looking, are we seeing a change in these IEPs? Are they adding services if a student needs it? Do I see progress coming up? Is a student's math level increasing or English level increasing? Or am I seeing stagnation? Am I seeing a student not have any progress?
Estoy repasando a ver si hay algún progreso, si no hay progreso, si hubo una falta de progreso año tras año, ¿verdad? Porque estoy comparando los IEPs de los años anteriores.
I'm also going to be looking at if there are any notes from the parent or from the school, right? Maybe there was a note from a parent saying, I want my child to be evaluated, that the school ignored. Or maybe there's a note from the school saying, we're not able to provide speech language therapy this year, so we're taking it off the IEP. All those kinds of things I want to make sure that I'm reading and then I'm making a note of it.
También quiero repasar a ver si hay algunas notas, notas de los padres, notas de la escuela. Si, por ejemplo, el padre pidió, quiero que mi hijo sea evaluado, y el distrito contestó que no podía, o si les removieron un servicio, por ejemplo, del aula, porque ese año no se lo podían prever y se lo quitaron del IEP. Esas son las cosas que quiero repasar.
I'm also going to look at evaluations. Any evaluations done by the Department of Education or the district, any evaluations that maybe the parent got outside of the school that was provided. And I'm going to look at what did those evaluations say, what kind of evaluations were there, and whether it seemed like they were comprehensive, whether they really covered what that evaluation was supposed to cover.
Estoy repasando también las evaluaciones, si fueron hechas por el distrito, si fueran hechas afuera del distrito, tal vez los padres buscaron a alguien independiente que evaluara al estudiante. ¿Qué dicen esas evaluaciones? Y si el distrito escolar repasó y tomó en cuenta estas evaluaciones.
I'm also going to look at progress reports. If there are report cards there, maybe I can see if a student really is making progress or not. And I'm also going to look at disciplinary reports. Is this a student who's getting in trouble a lot and the school is not bothering to find out why? Or are they suspending this student without considering that maybe there's a disability that could be causing whatever the conduct is?
Estoy repasando los reportes de progreso, también los reportes de disciplina. Si tal vez algo que está surgiendo en la escuela o en la clase, el estudiante no está siendo investigado a ver si tal vez por alguna discapacidad se está comportando mal.
And then I'm looking, what is the case here? Am I seeing that there was a failure to evaluate? Maybe this student has issues with speech language, but I see there wasn't a speech language evaluation done in 3 years, right? Or maybe there was a failure to make an appropriate placement recommendation. Maybe this is a student who in the IEP, it says needs a lot of one-to-one attention, right? He can't be in a classroom with 10 kids, but then they put the child into a classroom with general education students. Those kinds of things are what I'm looking, what kind of case is this?
Estoy repasando a ver qué tipo de caso es. Fue que el distrito falló en evaluar al estudiante, si tal vez lo tenía que evaluar en lenguaje. El distrito falló en hacer una recomendación apropiada, no colocó al estudiante en una clase adecuada para él o ella, falló en tener una reunión del año escolar. Esos son los puntos que estoy viendo a ver.
And it's almost always a combination of things. Even sometimes when a parent would come in saying, all I want here is some extra tutoring, right? Maybe that a child didn't get, a child is really far behind, not getting the right services, just wants some more tutoring. And we decide we want to take the case. When we really look into the facts, we always find something. Maybe they also didn't do the right evaluations, right? Maybe they also didn't have the kid into a right class size. Or maybe they didn't provide transportation, right? All of these things kind of form all of our potential claims that we're complaining about in the complaint.
Las posibles quejas pueden ser: no evaluaron adecuadamente, no le proveyeron los servicios, no lo colocaron en la clase adecuada con la cantidad de estudiantes necesario, tal vez no le provieron el transporte necesario. Esos son los reclamos que podemos considerar.
Yeah. And just so we have a question here from T saying, both my sons have IEPs that say they require one-to-ones. And since we're homeschooling, they can't provide that. So it's hard to help them both when they're in open classes at the same time. Can I demand any type of help with that from the school? So that's one of these really fact-specific situations, which I can't say yes or no to. All I can say is there's a lot of situations like this, right, with COVID and this homeschooling. And that's something that I would definitely think that you would want to dig more deep into or have an attorney dig more deep into. So at the end of this, you'll have my email address at the end, as well as you can go to the Cuddy Law Firm website and reach out to us so we can maybe speak more in detail about that.
Si tiene alguna pregunta, la pregunta que veo es indicando algo de la educación remota, pero pueden contactarme vía correo electrónico para hablar después sobre su pregunta.
Okay. So it's normally a combination of these things whenever we're seeing them. So now, in order to decide what kind of case it's really going to be, one of the most important things are evaluations, right? Because evaluations are going to tell me how is the student performing, what does the student need, and how do we get the student to where he or she needs to be.
Repasando a ver qué caso es, uno de los puntos más importantes son las evaluaciones, para ver cómo está el estudiante, qué necesita el estudiante, dónde debe de estar el estudiante en sus necesidades.
Okay, so why do we need these evaluations? Because we're not the experts, right? I'm not an expert. I'm not a neuropsychologist. I'm not a speech language pathologist. I can't look at a kid's records and say, this child needs to have speech language therapy 5 times a week, right? Or this child needs to be in a classroom with 6 students. as far as I want to consider myself as much of an expert as possible with regard to the law, I'm definitely not an expert with regard to what a child's proper educational placement should be.
Ya entonces, ¿por qué se necesitan las evaluaciones? Es porque yo no soy un experto en el área. Aunque yo no soy un neuropsicólogo, yo no soy un terapatólogo del habla, aunque que yo me considero tal vez conocer bien la ley, no sé qué necesidades necesita el estudiante.
Another question just came up that I just want to address. So Z asks, can a child with a classification and a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder who is well behaved in school but misbehaves outside of school get ABA at home paid for by the New York City DOE? That's a fact-specific question, but I do just want to point out that it really depends. There are arguments that if a student is behaving in school and is able to get educated in school, then the DOE has no further obligation to make. But there might also be an argument, by an ABA provider that you need to have therapy at home so that the ABA is really being applied correctly in the school. That's another situation where I would say to definitely get in touch with us. I can't give any specific opinions either way on that, but it is a difficult issue that I've seen come up before.
Algo que se debe considerar es si el estudiante necesita las evaluaciones, qué necesita específicamente. Sé que a veces es un poco difícil y es un problema que he visto a veces surgir.
Okay. So now, what are the kinds of evaluations that I'm looking at, right? Because as I said, I'm not the expert. I want to get some experts to really tell me what a student needs. So here's the list of evaluations. I'll just quickly read through them, but there's a neuropsychological evaluation. That's going to give diagnoses, right? It might diagnose a student as having autism or Down syndrome or any number of potential disabilities.
¿Qué son los tipos de evaluaciones que existen? Voy a repasar unas cuantas. La primera es una evaluación neuropsicológica que puede proveer un diagnóstico. Por ejemplo, si el estudiante tiene Down syndrome o algún otro tipo de discapacidad.
Okay. There's also a speech language evaluation or occupational therapy evaluation or physical therapy evaluation. All of these will look into, are there deficits in these areas, right? In speech, in daily living, in motor skills, and what kind of services do we need to get this student to be able to make progress in those areas?
También existe la evaluación del habla, ocupacional y terapia física, que indican los déficits que tiene el estudiante y en qué áreas se necesita trabajar.
There's also an assistive technology evaluation, which, sometimes school districts and parents don't really think about is there a device that might help this student? The term for it is access the curriculum, right? Is a student not able to really connect with his schooling, but maybe with an iPad that reads, text out loud to him, or a pen that reads written text out loud to him, might that allow him or her to access the curriculum better?
También existe la evaluación de tecnología asistiva, ¿verdad? Si hay algo que puede ayudar al estudiante tener acceso al currículo, por ejemplo, una computadora o un bolígrafo, lapicero, que lea lo que el estudiante está subrayando y ayude a entender lo que está leyendo.
There's also a functional behavior assessment, which is when a student's behaviors are interfering with their learning or the learning of other students in the classroom. And so you want to look at why are those behaviors taking place? And then after that, you can look into how do we then fix those behaviors from happening.
También existe la evaluación de comportamiento para determinar si hay algunos comportamientos que están afectando el aprendizaje del estudiante o el aprendizaje de los compañeros en la clase. Si hay algún problema, ¿verdad?, con los comportamientos, entonces, ¿qué se puede hacer para corregir esos comportamientos? Esa es otra evaluación.
Now, sometimes parents think that a functional behavior assessment is when a student is very aggressive, right, or a bully or fights other kids, and that isn't necessarily the case. It can be when a student refuses to do schoolwork, right, or when a student tries to run out of the classroom. Those are behaviors that interfere with learning, so we should figure out why it's happening.
A veces los padres piensan que esta evaluación es simplemente si el estudiante tiene comportamientos agresivos, pero no es el caso. El simple hecho es que el estudiante no quiere hacer la asignación, el estudiante salga de la clase varias veces. Esos son los comportamientos que esta evaluación también puede evaluar y buscarle una ayuda.
We've also had success at our firm getting things like music therapy evaluations or art therapy evaluations, right? These are things that the Department of Education is never really going to do. They can, but they generally don't. But we might see that maybe a particular student connects better with music or with art, and it allows them to access their curriculum better or deal with anxiety issues, things like that are preventing them from making progress.
Algunas evaluaciones que nosotros hemos considerado para nuestros propios casos han sido evaluaciones de terapia, terapia de música y también terapia en arte, porque tal vez pueden ayudar al estudiante a tener acceso al currículo o ayudar con la ansiedad que tal vez sienten al diario vivir en la escuela.
So now when I'm referring to these evaluations and the recommendations that they might be giving, I'm generally referring to an independent evaluation that we get outside of the DOE. So now the DOE evaluations, or district evaluations, if you're dealing with a school district outside of New York City, unfortunately, for the most part, they don't contain all the information that we want, right? They generally don't make recommendations. They say that they'll let the IEP team make the recommendations, and they don't do all of the testing that we really think is necessary to determine what kind of services a student might need.
Cuando me refiero a las evaluaciones, estoy refiriéndome a las evaluaciones independientes educacional, ¿verdad? Que a veces nosotros buscamos que un proveedor fuera del distrito escolar haga. ¿Por qué? Porque a veces no estamos de acuerdo con lo que las evaluaciones del distrito incluyen. Por ejemplo, no proponen recomendaciones, sin embargo, indican en el reporte que van a permitir que el equipo en la reunión de la IEP tome la decisión de lo que sea necesario. A veces tampoco evalúan todo lo necesario, lo que nosotros pensamos que puede proveer más información del estudiante.
So one of the first things we do when we're doing these record reviews, when we decide we're taking a case, is we'll look at the evaluations that the district performed, and we look if there's something that we can disagree with, right? Like if it's not really giving us the information we need, and we would disagree with the fact that maybe it doesn't have recommendations or it didn't use the right kind of tests. And under the IDEA, a parent can disagree with an evaluation that the district performs if there's a valid reason, that we're disagreeing with that evaluation, and we can request that the district pay for a private, independent evaluation that we receive outside of the district.
Algo como se obtienen las evaluaciones independientes es algo de considerar. Es, por ejemplo, que la ley federal, el IDEA, permite que los padres no estén de acuerdo con una evaluación, entonces, por alguna razón legítima, y le puedan pedir al distrito escolar que le paguen las evaluaciones independientes.
Now, under the plain reading of the IDEA, it indicates that you disagree with an evaluation that's being performed, right? But what if a school district doesn't perform a speech language evaluation and you have a student who's nonverbal, right? So there's arguments there to be made that we're entitled to independent evaluations from the DOE or a district failing to perform an evaluation. But those are the kinds of things that we fight out during the hearing, which is why it's so important to consider potentially going to hearing on these cases.
Algo que se puede considerar es, por ejemplo, la ley indica que el padre tiene el derecho de no estar de acuerdo con las evaluaciones, pero tal vez que el distrito no evalúe al estudiante en una área específica. Por ejemplo, no es verbal, entonces no le hicieron la evaluación del habla, pero son evaluaciones entonces que uno puede demandar que se le consideren o se le hagan.
Okay, so now let's say we put in a request for these evaluations, and now we're in the process of drafting the due process complaint. One thing I want to note just before we get into the due process complaint is technically when we put in a request for independent evaluations, the district is supposed to grant them, or they're supposed to put up a fight in terms of they're supposed to file for their own due process hearing so they can defend their evaluations. 99% of the time, if not more, they just don't respond. So it becomes another issue that we fold into the complaint, that they failed to respond to our request for evaluations.
Algo que deben de saber es que el distrito tiene el derecho de pelearle el pedido de evaluaciones independientes. Claro, 99% de las veces el distrito no les responde a los padres. Ellos tienen la obligación de o responder o pelear contra los padres en un debido proceso. Pero si no, es otro reclamo que se le puede hacer en la demanda que uno someta contra el distrito escolar.
Yeah. So now we're drafting the due process complaint, right? And this isn't something where it's a one-page, saying there was no FAPE here, so we want something, right? This is an in-depth document, and we're going to be talking about what diagnoses the student has versus what they might have been classified with. Maybe they were diagnosed with autism, but they were classified with learning disability, right? We're going to look at the educational history. What kind of classes has this kid been in for the past 3 years? Any evaluation results? We're going to look at progress that he or she has made or did not make. And we're going to put all of that into a background so that a judge could read this complaint and really understand why we're bringing this case.
Entonces, vamos a considerar el diagnóstico que el estudiante tiene, el historial de educación que se le propuso de parte del distrito que han tenido hasta el día de hoy, los resultados de las evaluaciones, si el estudiante ha tenido algún progreso. Entonces vamos a combinar todo para que el juez sepa el historial del estudiante antes de ver los reclamos.
And then we're going to put together in this complaint, what are our claims, right? What are the things that we're alleging? So normally it'll be things like the Department of Education failed to consider an appropriate methodology for students with autism, or the Department of Education failed to consider increasing speech language services even though the student is nonverbal, or the Department of Education failed to provide transportation for a student who needs specialized transportation to go to and from home and school. And we list out every single claim and the facts that really make that claim.
Entonces vamos a combinar todo y preparar la demanda con los reclamos y a ver cómo se le puede resolver los reclamos.
And then we look at the relief, right? We put in there what the relief is. What should the district do now, right? They messed up. What do we want them to do? So normally we want them to consider a non-public school for students like the student that we're dealing with, right? Or we want them to give compensatory services. Because this student didn't get speech language therapy for the past year, we want 150 hours of speech language therapy. Or we're looking at potentially private school placement. All of these things that we're asking for in return, or rather, because the school district didn't do what they were supposed to do for so many years.
Entonces vamos a ver qué el distrito debía de haber hecho para el estudiante, cómo se le puede ayudar al estudiante a llegar a un punto lo cual ha fallado en lograr por la falta del distrito escolar.
So now after the due process complaint, right, we have the whole document, we put it together, we file it, what happens? So first, you get an Iho appointment. Iho is an impartial hearing officer. That's just another name for the judge who's going to be overseeing this case.
Entonces, cuando se somete a la demanda, se asigna un juez, también conocido como un Iho, un juez imparcial.
Next, there's the resolution period. This is a period of 30 days during which the district might reach out to you and say, hey, we don't need to go to hearing. We'll give you, this, and this if you withdraw your complaint.
También existe después un periodo de 30 días. Es durante el tiempo que el distrito escolar tiene para proponerle una resolución a los padres cuando someten la demanda.
Now, the resolution period is really designed to potentially avoid having to go to a hearing. Unfortunately, it's very rare that you'll see that a district really provides all the things that you're asking for during the resolution period. So usually you're going to a hearing regardless if you're already at this point, but it gives them the opportunity to maybe offer you everything you're looking for, and they can save their time and money and your time and money.
El periodo de resolución es el periodo que puede evitar que uno vaya a un juicio. Claro que usualmente no es el caso, pero es el tiempo que existe para que eso ocurra.
And at the same time, what we're doing as attorneys is we're preparing disclosure and witnesses. Disclosure is all of the physical evidence in terms of documents and things that we intend to bring at the hearing. We have to give it to the school 5 days in advance of the hearing or disclose it to the school. That's why it's called disclosure. And then we're also looking at what witnesses do we have. We're probably going to want the parent to talk a little bit about what's going on, but do we have an evaluator already who can potentially review the records and give an expert opinion? Those are all things that we're considering and we're putting together as we're preparing for hearing.
Entonces hay que prepararse para la evidencia, conocida como disclosures, también los testigos que van a testificar en el juicio.
So now, as that's happening, after the 30-day mark, you're probably going to get a pre-hearing conference scheduled. So like the name, it's prior to the hearing, you're just meeting up, right? And it's you, it's the other party, and it's the impartial hearing officer. And what you're deciding there, or what you're discussing there, is whether both sides are even going to be presenting a case, right? Maybe the district's going to say, yeah, you're right, we messed up here. They're not going to say it like that, but they're going to say, we're not putting on a case. We're not going to try and argue this. We're just going to let it go. You're going to look at how many witnesses. Maybe the parent plans on bringing 3 witnesses and the district wants to bring 3 witnesses. You need to figure that out because you have a time schedule to go to. You're going to look at what are the issues. Was anything resolved? Maybe I put in my complaint that the district never responded to my request for evaluations, and between the complaint and the pre-hearing conference, maybe they did decide to respond, and that's not an issue anymore. So those are some of the things we're considering.
Entonces, ¿qué sigue? El siguiente paso es una conferencia de audiencia o de juicio ante el juicio que se conoce como el pre-hearing conference, en lo cual se determina si va a haber un caso, qué va a ocurrir, qué fechas se van a asignar, etc.
We're going to look at all. We're going to look. Oh, sorry. There's more?
Para entonces determinar cuáles pasos tomar a concluir. Go ahead, Mark.
We're also going to look at if there are any specific rules or stipulations, right? Maybe this judge says that I want all witnesses to be disclosed to each other 5 days before, right? Or maybe we can all agree that a certain fact happened and we don't have to fight about it and we can just discuss that at the pre-hearing conference. Additionally, we're going to look at whether there might be an interim order, right? So an interim order would be it's a decision by the judge, not for the whole case, not the final decision, but a decision in the middle. For example, it could be a decision saying, this parent was entitled to evaluations. Before we go any further, I'm granting all of their evaluations. They can get the evaluations done, and let's meet back here in a month, and we can continue this hearing.
Entonces, vamos a ver qué se puede resolver, si hay alguna orden tal vez intermitente que se puede firmar por el juez para, por ejemplo, las evaluaciones. Es un tiempo donde se determinan los pasos que siguen en la reunión de resolución.
So Maria has a question here saying, can the district demand as part of a settlement pursuant to a resolution session, withdrawal of all complaints, including systemic, Section 504, and other civil rights violations, even if the district staff have no authority to negotiate compensation for civil rights violations? Maria, that's kind of out of my wheelhouse a little bit. I can't give you an answer to that just like that, but feel free to email me or the firm. Maybe we can discuss that in a little more detail.
María tenía una pregunta que si el distrito puede demandar como parte de su acuerdo durante el periodo de resolución, eliminar las quejas, incluyendo demandas sobre la sección 504, otras violaciones de derechos civiles, aunque que el distrito que esté participando, el miembro del distrito que esté participando, no tiene autoridad para negociar compensaciones por las violaciones de los derechos civiles. Eso es algo que no puedo contestarle, pero tal vez me pueden llamar y yo proveerle mi información.
So now you finished the pre-hearing conference, you got everything in order, you have your evidence, right? So now it's time for the hearing.
Ahora concluyó el periodo de resolución, lo que sigue es el juicio.
The hearing is not as scary as it might sound. So what happens at this hearing, right? You're in a conference room. You're not in a courtroom. You're not in a federal courthouse. You're not in a state courthouse. You're in a conference room. If you're dealing with New York City, you're inside a Department of Education building. If you're outside the district, you might be meeting at one of their school administrative buildings.
El juicio no es tan intimidante como uno pensaría. Sin embargo, si está presente en la ciudad de Nueva York, está en la oficina del distrito escolar. Si fuera del distrito de la ciudad, está tal vez en una locación donde ellos conducen sus reuniones anuales.
And not only is the room not very scary, but the judge is not scary. They might sometimes be mean, but something to note is that these aren't federal judges appointed by the president. They're not state judges who were picked by people. They're attorneys who applied for a job. So kind of having that in mind really puts in perspective what this process is really like.
Tal vez algo que pueden considerar es que los jueces no son jueces federales ni estatales, sino son abogados que han aplicado para una posición para ver los casos. No son intimidantes, sino a veces pueden ser un poquito no muy agradables.
So, now what's going to happen is both parties are going to enter in evidence. In a real court case, sometimes you enter in the evidence as the case is going on, right? You might bring up some kind of document and ask a witness if this is a document they've seen. Generally, in these kinds of cases, we just both submit a whole packet of evidence. And oftentimes in New York City, the school's not even submitting anything.
Entonces, se somete la evidencia de las dos partes. El distrito escolar a veces ni somete evidencia.
And now Sarah just had a great question saying no opening statements. Nope, there are opening statements. I forgot to put that into this slide. So you're absolutely right. Right after you enter in the evidence, or sometimes it can happen before, but generally in my experience afterwards, both parties can then give an opening statement. And for the most part, the opening statement in my situations tends to be pretty similar to the due process complaint, right? I want to lay out what the facts are and what we're going to learn from all of the witnesses and how we're going to learn why this school really didn't do what they were supposed to do.
Sara preguntó que si hay discursos iniciales, y sí, pueden ocurrir antes o después de la evidencia ser sometida para uno aprender qué es lo que va a suceder en el juicio.
Okay, so then the district gets to go first, right? Because, and this is something I don't think I touched on, it's the district who bears the burden, right? And what that means is the district is the one who has to prove that they did provide a free, appropriate public education. Even though you're the one bringing the complaint, you're not the one who has to prove it. They have to prove it. If they do put on their case, now you have to respond. Well, why isn't that considered good enough proof? But they're the ones who have to bring on the case first.
Deben de saber que el distrito escolar debe de proveer su caso primero. Ellos son los que tienen la obligación de proveer su caso inicialmente cuando hay una falta de educación apropiada que se le ha prohibido al estudiante.
Okay, so they're going to present their evidence, their witnesses, and then the parent or the parent attorney gets to cross-examine, right? So this is kind of like what you might see in a movie or a TV show, where then the lawyer gets to ask every witness specific questions to really figure out if, not necessarily if they're telling the truth. I mean, that's definitely going to be part of it, but are they really as much of an expert as they might say they are, right? Are they so confident that this student doesn't need these extra services like they might say is the case?
Entonces hay que considerar el testimonio, qué está siendo dicho, qué es vigente, qué es falso, cómo van a defender el caso.
So two quick questions just came up. Maria, with regard to dependency placement, that's again something that it would really depend on the specific facts. So maybe reach out afterwards. And then Diane says, if you believe the hearing officer is acting with a bias, is there any recourse? That's a great question, because I think that definitely appears to be the case, sometimes. Whether that is or isn't, I don't know. But that's something that you might want to consider an appeal for. And I'm going to talk a little bit about appeals. We should have time. We're coming to the end. So I'll be able to talk a little bit about appeals and what you can bring up in those.
María preguntó sobre la locación dependency, es algo que podemos hablar luego. También voy a hablar sobre las apelaciones ya que estamos casi concluyendo.
So then after the district puts on their case or doesn't put on their case, which in my experience is the majority of the time, then the parent gets to present their case, right? They get to present witnesses. If they manage to get those evaluations, either through an interim order or through the school granting them, those evaluators can come in and testify, and then they will stand and be cross-examined by the school district.
Ya después que el distrito presente su caso o no lo presente, porque mi experiencia es que no presentan usualmente un caso, es que los padres entonces pueden presentar su caso, sus testigos, y tal vez como testigos los evaluadores que conducieron las evaluaciones independientes.
Right. And then you're going to have closing statements. Sometimes there could be closing briefs, right? Maybe there's so much that rather than trying to just make an argument, just during the hearing, you say, could we have 2 weeks? Let's both submit some really in-depth legal arguments about, which side should win.
Ya cuando concluye el juicio, se puede someter un brief que incluye la ley y la información de los reclamos, o pedir hacer una conclusión oral en el récord.
Okay, so you submit everything, the case is finished, now it's waiting and waiting and waiting until finally you get a decision.
Ya que se someta todo, entonces ustedes esperan que concluya con una decisión del juez.
Now, what's the IHO going to do in this decision? They're going to lay out the facts of the case. They're going to lay out both parties' arguments. They're going to make factual determinations and then legal determinations. So factual determinations is, did something happen? Maybe both sides are arguing about whether something happened, right? Maybe the school is saying, no, the student was getting a paraprofessional the entire time. And the parent's saying, no, the student never got a paraprofessional. So the IHO needs to make factual determinations. What actually happened or didn't happen?
Entonces, la decisión del juez va a presentar todos los, lo que ocurrió, los argumentos de las dos partes, las determinaciones de el historial, lo que en realidad ocurrió, e igual de determinaciones legales.
Right now, the legal determinations are both sides agree a certain fact might have happened, but does that mean that one side is wrong? So, for example, the school says a classroom of 12 kids is the right kind of placement, and it let this student make progress. And the parent says, no, yes, he was in a classroom of 12 students, but that wasn't the right placement. So it's a legal question of, is this placement an appropriate placement or not? So they're going to make those determinations as well.
Las determinaciones actuales pueden ser sobre lo que ocurrió, pero entonces la legal es si, por ejemplo, la clase es apropiada para el estudiante, sabiendo las necesidades del estudiante.
And then finally, the IHO is going to say whether the district fulfilled their obligation. Did the district do the right thing and provide a free, appropriate public education or not?
Entonces, el juez va a determinar que si el distrito escolar concluyó con sus obligaciones de proveerle al estudiante una educación apropiada.
So there's a good question from Sarah asking if we can talk a little bit more about resolution periods or if there's a compulsory mediation. So the reason why I tend to gloss over resolution periods when I'm doing these kinds of presentations is I haven't seen resolution periods ever lead to a positive result. Sometimes we'll file a complaint that says this kid is in a wrong placement and needs all these extra services, and the district will says, okay, well, we'll resolve this. We'll agree to have an IEP meeting, and that's it. So it's something that I tend to skip over. The parent is required to take part in that meeting. The parent's required to there has to be the opportunity to have that resolution meeting. But there's no requirement of a one-day mediation, like you said, might be in another state, or having any presiding judge preside over the resolution meeting.
Sara preguntó que si podíamos repasar más el periodo de resolución. La razón por que yo no hablo mucho sobre el tema es porque mi experiencia no son muy positivas durante el periodo de resolución. Tal vez el estudiante no tenga la clase apropiada y el distrito diga, bueno, vamos a tener una reunión de IEP, pero ya, eso es lo que concluye, no ocurre más nada. No hay un mediador como la experiencia en algunos otros estados, sino es un requisito que los padres participen y un representante del distrito participe.
I also want to note that the majority of my cases are in New York City. So a lot of times when you hear me talking about resolution meetings, I'm talking about New York City, where they tend to not put much care into actually doing these resolution meetings. Outside New York City, it might be a little bit different. We do practice all over. Just my personal experience tends to be mostly New York City. So your experience might vary depending on where you are.
Su experiencia puede variar dependiendo de dónde usted es localizado. Mi experiencia es practicar primeramente en los casos de la ciudad de Nueva York. Nosotros representamos clientes en todo el estado, pero hablo sobre la experiencia que he tenido en el distrito escolar de la ciudad.
Okay. And with regard to any, I just realized I'm getting some private questions in the chat. Best way to get in touch with me for those private, more fact-specific cases is to shoot me an email. It'll be easier for me to respond and really give a better answer to that.
Creo que estoy recibiendo mensaje personal, privado. Si tienen alguna pregunta que no lo quieren hacer en el chat para que todo el mundo vea, por favor, mándenme un correo electrónico y así podemos conversar.
Yep. So now the judge made the decision, right? We're looking at, was there a FAPE denial or not, right? Did they fail to provide that education? If yes, or rather, the question is, did the district meet its obligation, right? If yes, case closed. The district met its obligation. There's nothing else to decide here. But wait for the appeal. We'll talk about that. But if no, if they didn't provide an appropriate education, now what happens?
Entonces, ya tenemos la decisión. El distrito cumplió con sus obligaciones de proveerle al estudiante una educación gratis y apropiada. Si la respuesta es sí, el caso ha concluido, pero espérese para la apelación. Si no, entonces, ¿qué ocurre?
Okay. So let's say that there was a FAPE denial, right? The district did not do what they were supposed to do. What's the kind of relief? Well, the judge can order, you have to have a new IEP meeting, and you have to make sure that in this IEP meeting, you have to have this, and this service, right? They can order compensatory education. This student was denied a FAPE for 2 years. So to make up for that, we want 500 hours of tutoring, right? It's a pretty crazy amount, but for example, the judge can say, we want new evaluations. I'm ordering that there be these independent evaluations conducted. And sometimes, depending on the case, very specific cases, the judge can say, I'm ordering placement in this specific school for this school year.
Puede ser que el juez ordene una reunión de la IP nueva, servicio compensatorio, horas de terapia del habla, por ejemplo, evaluaciones independientes, también una colocación en una escuela privada, puede que sea alguno de los que ordene el juez.
Okay. And now let's say you didn't win the case for some reason. Now you can appeal, right? So there's a higher board in New York called the State Review Office, which you can appeal any cases. And what that means is you're saying something went wrong in this case. I want a higher judge to listen to it.
Entonces, si no ganan su demanda, pueden apelar hacia la oficina estatal de repaso, que es ustedes diciendo, algo no ocurrió correctamente en este juicio, necesito que un juez de más calibrar repase el caso y tome una decisión diferente.
Now, first, there are very strict timelines. So if, for example, if you, from the date of decision, you have 25 days to file what's known as a notice of intention to seek review, and then 40 days to file your request for review, that final appeal. If you're so much as a day late, sometimes that can bar the entire case from being heard.
Quiero que sepan que hay tiempos muy limitados para someter una apelación. Una notificación con el intento de apelar tiene que ser sometido en 25 días después de recibir la orden del juez. Entonces tienen 40 días para someter la apelación completa.
Okay.
Tomen nota que si fallan de someter un documento, tal vez hasta por un día, eso puede prohibir que ustedes apelen su caso.
Now, this isn't your chance to try the case again, right? To say, okay, well, I want to do this again in front of a different judge. That's not what's going to happen. There's not any new evidence that's being considered. You're looking at whether the judge in that impartial hearing officer, whether they did something wrong, whether they made a wrong ruling, or whether they made a wrong determination as to whether there was a FAPE denial or not.
Este no es un tiempo para ustedes decidir o determinar que quieren relitigar el caso, sino es considerar que si el juez falló en interpretar la ley correctamente o no consideró evidencia en específica.
Now, sometimes new evidence can be considered, but it's not to say, oh, I have this more stuff that should be considered that I didn't bring in before. It might be something like, I tried to put in this evaluation into evidence and the judge said no. So I want you to take a look at it, right? Because now you're arguing that the judge did something wrong. That's why you couldn't bring in this evidence. But generally, it's not a chance for you to try doing the case all over again.
Como dije anteriormente, pueden someter evidencia nueva, la cual no ha sido considerada en el juicio original, porque, por ejemplo, ustedes trataron de someter alguna evaluación como evidencia durante el juicio, pero el juez la negó. Entonces, ustedes le están pidiendo a la oficina estatal que repase la evidencia que el juez rechazó.
So to address that prior question before of what if there's bias, it'll be a hard argument to make, but if you have some kind of evidence for it, that might be where you would want to bring that up and say, this hearing officer was really biased against me and they acted the wrong way. Their rulings were against me only because of that bias.
Entonces, si creen que el juez no fue recto, pueden tal vez tratar de someter algo a la corte estatal.
So Maria asked if I can provide the appropriate strategy for addressing issues that were not addressed in the original complaint, but were raised during hearing without objection. It really depends so much on a case-by-case basis. It depends on what the issue is. Why was it raised without objection? I mean, generally, if there is an issue that everyone's allowing in, even though it's not in the complaint, you could treat it the same as any other issue. But it really, it's a very fact-specific basis. I also want to know, we're coming to the end of this, and I do intend to finish before 1. But if you reach out to us, we can review records and decide if there's a case there, for us to potentially take. So please reach out to us afterwards and we can really look into a little more detail. Sarah has a question, which I do want to answer. How long do the hearings generally last? It can vary so much. I've had cases where I'm ready with all my evidence and all my witnesses, and the DOE says, well, we're not putting on a case. I submit all the documents. Even the witnesses can submit written statements instead of testifying, right? So, and I get everything done in 10, 15 minutes. I've literally probably had a hearing completely finished within an hour. Other times you can have a hearing that takes 2 weeks, in terms of 14 days that are spread out over the course of months, right? It can last a very long time. It can vary so much. And Lisa's question, how long does the SRO have to decide? I believe, I'm not 100% sure, I believe they have 30 days from once all the documents are in, but timelines are so all over the place with this process. Another thing to note, hearing officers are supposed to be assigned right away. In New York City, there's been a delay of, I think at this point, we're close to 6 months on some cases of not getting a judge assigned, and there's no recourse. We've been filing state complaints and doing everything we can, but they're playing very fast and loose with the timelines because they are so overwhelmed. Sorry, Catherine, I didn't give time to interpret that. I don't know how much you're able to summarize.
A ver, María preguntó que si pueden proveer una estrategia apropiada para seguir. No, eso todo depende de cada caso. Sarah preguntó cuánto duran generalmente los juicios. Eso varía, depende del caso, depende de los jueces, también el tiempo que se tome para asignar un juez.
Okay. Last slide, case is finished, now what, right? So your case gets formally closed. We got everything you needed. We're going to help you with making sure if you got, let's say, evaluations that were ordered, we're going to help get that set up. If you got compensatory services, we're going to make sure that's set up and ready to go. And then we're going to formally close the case and end the representation. But it's on you now to keep an eye out for any changes. You know, maybe we got a great placement and all of a sudden next year, the DOE tries to change the placement. Or maybe they say, oh, well, now, you know, your child's doing so good, we can remove some of these services. Something you want to keep an eye out for and potentially get back in touch with us for.
Entonces, el caso concluye. ¿Qué ocurre? Nosotros ayudamos a implementar la orden del juez, también concluimos el caso formalmente. Le advertimos que mantengan los ojos al tanto de cualquier cambio y si necesario no contacten de nuevo.
Okay, I have here the due process complaint timeline. It just goes over what I just mentioned: record review, request for evaluations, draft the complaint, prepare your evidence, you go to the hearing, and you get your decision. That's the general timeline that these go along.
Esto es un repaso de lo que repasamos anteriormente. Repasen los records, pidan las evaluaciones, preparen la demanda, el testigo de evidencia, el juicio y entonces la decisión.
Okay, and that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. You can also call the firm if you want to set up a consultation or if you want us to review some of the records to decide whether there may or may not be issues. Happy to answer any questions over email that I'm able to answer. Just to address that last question, Yulia, I don't know if there's a due process system that is similar to this one with the Medicaid system. So that's not something that I would be able to help you out with. However, you know, maybe get in touch with the firm. There might be someone else who might be able to help you. If you can see in the chat, Amanda Ford is putting my email address as well as the number for the main office. So you can call if you have any questions or concerns or I guess any questions about any specific part of this presentation. Thank you everyone for coming by. Hopefully I was able to address some of the questions you might have and illuminate the due process complaint system for you.
Amanda Ford ha colocado mi correo electrónico y el número de la oficina directamente. Si tienen algunas preguntas, por favor llamen. Gracias.
Thank you.